The ballroom went silent the moment Duke Lucien Ravenscar walked through the doors, not because anyone announced him, but because every breath in that glittering chamber suddenly carried the weight of his presence. 700 candles flickered against mirrored walls. 300 aristocrats in silk and velvet froze mid-conversation. And there, in the center of London's most exclusive winter assembly, stood the man they all feared. But no one dared acknowledge openly. The Duke, who had buried more political careers than any living nobleman in England. His eyes swept the room once, calculated every alliance in 3 seconds, and dismissed them all as beneath his concern. But tonight would be different. Tonight, someone had already decided to destroy him, and they were standing less than 20 feet away, smiling like an old friend. Stay with me until the final word, because what happens in the next hour will crack the foundation of everything you think you know about power. And I promise you, the ending will leave you breathless.
The
winter of 1812 had arrived in London like a judgment, all ice and darkness and silence that swallowed sound before it could echo. Inside Ashford House, the grandest estate in Mayfair, warmth existed only as performance. Fires roared in marble hearths. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across polished floors. Women laughed behind painted fans while men traded lies disguised as compliments. But beneath all that glittering civility, the real business of aristocracy moved like poison through expensive wine. Lucien Ravenscar understood that business better than most men understood their own names. He crossed the ballroom with the kind of authority that made grown lords step aside without realizing they had moved. 35 years old and built like a man who had spent his youth breaking things that refused to bend. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from northern stone. Sharp angles, cold eyes the color of winter storms, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile somewhere around his 20th birthday. His coat was black. His cravat was black. Everything about him seemed designed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. People noticed. They always noticed. A cluster of ministers near the refreshment tables went quiet as he passed. 2 countesses pretended to admire a painting on the far wall. Lord Pemberton, who had spent the last 3 months trying to secure a trade agreement with the Ravenscar shipping interests, suddenly discovered urgent business near the terrace doors. Lucien registered all of it without breaking stride. Power was not about what you said. Power was about what people did when you entered a room. He found his destination near the East Gallery, where a circle of older noblemen had gathered around the Duke of Somerset like courtiers attending a failing king. Somerset had money, but no vision. Land, but no strategy. Titles stretched back 6 generations, but not a single original thought among his entire bloodline. Yet he controlled votes in Parliament that Lucien needed, which meant enduring this particular waste of time. Somerset saw him approaching and smiled with all the warmth of a merchant calculating profit margins. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. We were just discussing the proposed tariffs on northern textiles." Lucien stopped at the edge of their circle. He did not bow. He did not smile. "The tariffs are theater, Somerset. Everyone in this room knows they will pass regardless of your objections." Somerset's smile tightened. Around them, the other lords shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps. But theater serves its purpose, does it not? It allows men of influence to demonstrate their relevance. Lucien studied him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make Somerset feel the weight of being measured and found wanting. "I did not come here to watch you perform, Somerset. I came because you sent word that you had reconsidered our arrangement regarding the Manchester Railway expansion. Have you, or was that also theater?" The Duke of Somerset glanced at his companions. None of them met his eyes. "I have reconsidered, yes, and I have decided that the Ravenscar terms are less favorable than previously discussed." Lucien did not move, did not blink. But something in the air around him changed, went colder, sharper. Less favorable. Interesting choice of words. What would you consider favorable, Somerset? More money? More land? More assurances that your incompetent son will not gamble away your estate before you die? The circle of lords went absolutely still. One of them, Lord Hastings, ancient and half-deaf, made a small sound like a trapped animal. Somerset's face flushed red beneath his powdered wig. "You overstep, Ravenscar. I overstep when I'm wasting time with men who mistake posturing for negotiation. You will honor our original agreement, or I will ensure that every creditor you have buried beneath your family's debts suddenly discovers renewed interest in collecting. Your choice. Make it now. The ballroom continued around them, music and laughter and the clink of crystal glasses, but their small circle existed inside a pocket of absolute silence. Somerset looked like the man trying to decide which form of humiliation hurt less. Finally, he exhaled through his teeth. The original terms stand. Excellent. Have your solicitor send confirmation by morning. Lucien turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Behind him, Somerset's face collapsed into something ugly and defeated, but Lucien did not care. Caring was for men who confused business with personal attachment. He had learned that lesson from his father, who had died bitter and alone, but undefeated in every negotiation that mattered. He moved toward the terrace, needing air that did not taste like perfume and desperation, when a voice cut through the noise with the precision of a blade finding flesh. My dear Duke Ravenscar, how wonderful to see you crushing spirits so early in the evening. One might think you enjoy it. Lucien stopped, turned slowly. Lord Cedric Morcant stood beside a marble column, holding a glass of wine like a man entirely at ease with the world. 40 years old, elegant in the way snakes were elegant, all smooth movement and hidden venom. His smile reached his eyes but stopped somewhere before it arrived at anything resembling warmth. Dark hair touched with silver at the temples. A face that belonged in portrait galleries, handsome, refined, forgettable, until you realized he had been watching you for the past 10 minutes without blinking. Lucien had known Cedric since childhood. They had attended the same schools, moved through the same social circles, competed for the same political appointments. And through all of it, Cedric had smiled exactly like this while collecting grudges the way other men collected art. Cedric, I did not realize you were invited. Cedric's smile widened fractionally. Oh, I am always invited, Your Grace. I simply choose when to arrive. Unlike some, I do not need to announce my presence by making grown men weep into their brandy. Lucien moved closer, just enough to invade the comfortable distance most aristocrats maintained. Close enough to see the faint tension in Cedric's jaw. You have something to say, Cedric, or did you stop me simply to demonstrate that you still know my name? Cedric took a slow sip of wine, eyes never leaving Lucien's face. I wanted to congratulate you, actually, on your engagement. Lady Seraphina Vale is exquisite, beautiful, intelligent, impeccably bred. Everything a duchess should be. It must be refreshing to acquire something so valuable without having to threaten anyone. The words were pleasant. The tone was poison. Lucien felt something shift behind his ribs, something cold and dangerous that he kept locked away during daylight hours. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made servants find urgent business elsewhere. Careful, Cedric. Envy makes men careless, and careless men make mistakes. Cedric laughed softly. Envy? No, Your Grace, merely observation. You have built quite the fortress around yourself, haven't you? Titles, land, influence. Fear. But even fortresses have foundations, and foundations can crack under the right pressure. Lucien leaned in slightly. His voice dropped to something just above a whisper. If you have a point, make it. Otherwise, stop wasting oxygen. Cedric met his eyes without flinching. My point, Lucien, is that power built on fear is only as strong as the fear itself. And fear fades the moment people realize the monster is just a man. He set down his wine glass on the nearest table with exaggerated care. Enjoy your evening, Your Grace. I suspect the next few weeks will be illuminating for both of us. Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd like smoke dissolving into air. Lucien stood there for exactly 5 seconds, calculating variables, running through scenarios, analyzing threats. Cedric never said anything without intention. Every word was a move on a board that most people did not even realize existed, which meant something was coming, something designed to hurt. He turned sharply and moved through the ballroom toward the main entrance, already planning his response to whatever game Cedric had started. He would send investigators to dig into Cedric's finances, informants to monitor his movements, leverage to crush whatever scheme was brewing before it reached dangerous territory. Because that was how power worked in this world. You saw the threat. You buried it. You moved forward. But as Lucien descended the marble steps into the frozen London night, something unfamiliar scraped against the inside of his chest. Something he had not felt in years. Uncertainty. And Lucien Ravenscar hated uncertainty more than he hated weakness. Blackthorn. Keep rose from the northern cliffs like a monument to everything harsh and unforgiving about England's borderlands. 300 years old, built from local stone the color of storm clouds, surrounded by forests that swallowed sound and light with equal efficiency. No gardens softened its edges. No decorative architecture disguised its purpose. It was a fortress first and a home never. Lucien preferred it that way. He had returned from London 3 days ago and immediately buried himself in work. Estate reports, shipping manifests, letters from solicitors regarding properties scattered across 6 counties. Numbers made sense. Contracts had clear terms. Business did not require trust, only leverage. It was nearly midnight when he finally set down his pen and looked up from the desk in his study. The room was dark except for the fire burning low in the hearth and the single lamp casting shadows across stacks of documents. Outside, snow fell in thick silence against windows that overlooked nothing but wilderness and frozen emptiness. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. The door opened and Malcolm Thorne stepped inside, moving with the careful efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years serving the Ravenscar family without ever once overstepping his position. 60 years old, white hair cropped short, face weathered by decades of managing estates that required iron discipline more than warmth. Your Grace, a letter arrived by private courier an hour ago. The messenger insisted it was urgent. Lucien gestured toward the desk. Leave it. Thorne hesitated. The seal, Your Grace. It bears Lord Morcant's crest. Lucien went very still. Then he reached out slowly and took the envelope from Thorne's hand. Heavy paper, red wax seal pressed with Cedric's family insignia. The weight of it felt wrong, heavier than paper should feel. That will be all, Thorne. Your Grace. The door closed with a soft click. Lucien turned the envelope over in his hands once, then broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. Lucien, by now you have likely realized that our conversation at Ashford House was not mere social pleasantry. I am writing to inform you of certain discoveries I have made regarding your family's activities during the riots of 1809. Specifically, the orders you personally authorized that resulted in the deaths of 17 civilians in Manchester. I have documents, witness testimonies, financial records proving you paid officials to bury the investigation. These materials are currently secured in a location you will never find, but they can be made public at any time I choose. I am not interested in your money or your titles. What I want is simple: your complete withdrawal from the Manchester Railway expansion and your public endorsement of my appointment to the Northern Trade Commission. You have 1 week to comply. If you refuse, every newspaper in London will print the truth about the Ravenscar family's crimes. Parliament will demand investigations. The Crown will distance itself, and you will watch everything you have built collapse into ruin. I suggest you choose wisely. Lucien read it twice. Then he stood slowly, walked to the fireplace, and fed the letter into the flames. The paper curled and blackened and disappeared into ash, while he watched with no expression on his face at all. His mind moved through possibilities with mechanical precision. Cedric was not bluffing. He was too smart for empty threats, which meant the documents existed, which meant the evidence was real, which meant Lucien's entire position was suddenly vulnerable in ways he had not anticipated. The riots of 1809 had been chaos, violence spreading through industrial cities like plague. His father had been alive then, but already failing, already losing control. And Lucien, barely into his 20s, had made the decision to restore order through methods that Parliament would never have approved. Soldiers, arrests. And yes, civilians caught in the crossfire when orders were executed with more brutality than precision. He had buried it, paid witnesses to forget, intimidated officials into silence, because that was what powerful men did when survival required unpleasant choices. But Cedric had found it anyway. Found it and weaponized it and was now holding it over Lucien's head like an executioner's blade. Lucien turned away from the fire and stared out into the darkness beyond the windows. Snow continued falling. The forest was invisible. Nothing existed beyond this room except cold and silence, and the slow realization that he had made an enemy capable of destroying him. Not with violence, not with direct confrontation, but with truth. And truth, in aristocratic society, was more dangerous than any sword. Tag. Lady Seraphina Vale arrived at Blackthorn Keep 2 days later with a modest entourage and absolutely no illusions about what her life was about to become. The engagement had been arranged by their families 6 months ago. Strategic alliance, financial consolidation, bloodlines merging to create even more concentrated power within England's aristocracy. She had been raised for this, trained for it, prepared to become a duchess the way soldiers were prepared for war. What she had not been prepared for was Lucien Ravenscar himself. He met her in the main hall as her carriage arrived, standing at the top of the stone steps like a judge presiding over an execution. Tall, severe, dressed entirely in black despite the afternoon hour. No smile, no warmth, just cold assessment as she ascended toward him. Seraphina stopped 3 feet away and met his eyes without flinching. "Your Grace, Lady Seraphina." His voice was exactly what she expected. Deep, controlled, completely devoid of anything resembling welcome. She smiled politely. "Your home is imposing. It serves its purpose. And what purpose is that? Keeping the world at a distance. How fortunate, then, that I am no longer part of the world. I am part of your household now." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or irritation, but it vanished before she could identify it clearly. "Your rooms have been prepared. Thorn will show you." He turned to walk away. Seraphina did not move. "Your Grace." He stopped, looked back. "I was told we would dine together this evening, to discuss the arrangements for our wedding and the expectations of this union." Lucien studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze without wavering, letting him see that she was not some fragile ornament he could dismiss with coldness. Finally, he nodded once. 7 o'clock. Do not be late." Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadowed corridors of Blackthorn Keep like a ghost returning to haunt its own fortress. Seraphina watched him go, then exhaled slowly. Behind her, her lady's maid whispered nervously, "My lady, he is rather stern." Seraphina smiled without humor. "Stern is manageable, Anne. Cruel is another matter entirely. Let us hope we discover which one he truly is before it is too late to leave." But even as she said it, Seraphina knew the truth. Leaving was never an option. Not in this world. Not for women born into families that treated daughters like currency to be spent wisely. Dinner was exactly as cold as the castle itself. They sat at opposite ends of a table designed for 20 guests, separated by enough polished wood and silver candelabras to make conversation feel like shouting across a battlefield. Servants moved through the room like shadows, placing dishes, pouring wine, retreating before either of them could acknowledge their existence. Lucien ate with mechanical efficiency, barely looking up. Seraphina watched him carefully while cutting her food into precise portions. After 15 minutes of silence, she set down her fork. "Your Grace, I understand that this arrangement is transactional. But if we are to be married, I believe it would serve us both to establish some baseline of communication beyond awkward silence." Lucien looked up slowly. "Communication. How refreshing. Most women in your position simply smile and agree with everything I say. Most women in my position have not spent the last 5 years navigating London society without protection from powerful fathers or brothers. I learned quickly that survival requires more than beauty and obedience." "Is that what you think this is? Survival?" Seraphina smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think this is exactly what you have made it, Your Grace. A negotiation. You gain political alliance and legitimate heirs. I gain security and status. We are both purchasing something. Let us not pretend otherwise." Lucien leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of focus usually reserved for opponents across a chessboard. "You are not what I expected." "I could say the same. I was told you were ruthless, cold, impossible to predict. But ruthless men usually have reasons for their cruelty. What is yours?" Lucien's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "Reasons imply justification. I do not justify my decisions to anyone, least of all to a woman I have known for less than 6 hours." Seraphina picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip. "Then perhaps you should become accustomed to it, because if you believe I will spend the rest of my life in silence simply because you prefer isolation, you have misjudged me entirely." The room was so quiet she could hear the fire crackling in the hearth 20 feet away. Lucien stood abruptly. "Dinner is finished. We have barely eaten. Nevertheless, I have work that requires my attention. Of course you do. Heaven forbid you spend time with the woman you intend to marry. She said it calmly, without anger, but the words landed like thrown stones. Lucien stopped halfway to the door, did not turn around. You want honesty, Lady Seraphina? Here's honesty. I do not believe in love. I do not believe in companionship. I believe in maintaining power and ensuring that the Ravenscar name survives another generation. You will be a duchess. You will bear children. You will represent this family with dignity and composure. Beyond that, I have no expectations of you. And I suggest you develop none of me. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut. Seraphina sat alone at that enormous table, surrounded by servants who pretended not to have heard anything, and felt something cold settle into her chest. Not fear, not sadness, just the slow, terrible realization that she had agreed to marry a man who had turned himself into a weapon so sharp that he had forgotten how to be human. And worse, she had no idea if there was anything left inside him worth saving. Shit. 3 days passed in careful distance. Lucien buried himself in estate business and correspondence. Seraphina explored the castle, learned the names of servants who flinched when she spoke too quickly, discovered rooms that looked like they had not been opened in decades. On the 4th morning, she received a visitor. Lord Cedric Morcant arrived without invitation, riding through the snow-covered forest with 2 armed escorts and a smile that made her instantly wary. He was shown into the sitting room where she had been reading, and he bowed with exaggerated courtesy. Lady Seraphina, forgive the intrusion. I am Lord Cedric Morcant, an old acquaintance of your intended husband. Seraphina set down her book slowly. Lord Morcant, I was not aware the Duke was expecting guests. He is not. I came to speak with you, actually. With me. Yes. I believe it is important that you understand exactly what kind of man you are about to marry. Seraphina gestured toward the chair across from her, every instinct screaming danger. Please sit, and explain why you believe I need education on a subject I have already agreed to. Cedric sat, arranging himself with the casual elegance of someone entirely comfortable in hostile territory. Because agreement and understanding are very different things, my lady. Lucien Ravenscar is not simply cold or distant. He is dangerous. Specifically, he is a man who has committed acts that most of England's aristocracy would consider unforgivable if they ever came to light. Seraphina kept her face perfectly neutral. Bold accusations from someone I have only just met. Not accusations. Facts. During the riots of 1809, Lucien personally authorized military actions that resulted in civilian deaths. He then buried the evidence, paid off witnesses, and intimidated officials into silence. The Duke you are about to marry is responsible for murders that were never investigated. The room went very cold. Seraphina's hands remained steady in her lap, but her mind was racing through implications and calculations. Why are you telling me this? Cedric leaned forward slightly. Because I believe you deserve the truth before you bind yourself to him legally and permanently. And because I am offering you a choice that no one else will. Which is, leave him, quietly, before the wedding. I will ensure your family suffers no social consequences, no scandal, no whispers. You simply return to London and the engagement is dissolved by mutual agreement. And if I refuse, then I will release the evidence publicly. Parliament will demand investigations. The Crown will intervene. And Lucien Ravenscar will be destroyed. Completely. And you, as his wife, will be destroyed alongside him. Seraphina stood slowly, forcing Cedric to rise with her. You are threatening me, Lord Morcant. I'm offering you survival. There is a difference. Not from where I am standing. She crossed to the door and opened it herself. I will consider what you have said, but understand this. I do not respond well to manipulation, regardless of how elegantly it is presented. If you threaten me again, or attempt to control my decisions through fear, you will discover that I am not nearly as fragile as you believe. Cedric smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. You have spirit, Lady Seraphina. I respect that. But spirit will not protect you from the storm that is coming. He walked past her into the hallway. 1 week, my lady. That is how long you have to decide. Then he was gone. Seraphina closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly, mind churning through everything she had just heard. Murders, cover-ups, evidence that could destroy Lucien entirely. and she had 1 week to decide whether to save herself or stand beside a man who might be exactly the monster Cedric claimed he was. Bamasao. She found Lucien in his study late that night, bent over documents in the dim lamplight like a scholar obsessed with solving an impossible equation. He did not look up when she entered. "We need to talk. I am working." "I do not care." That made him look up. Serafina closed the door behind her and crossed the room until she stood directly in front of his desk, close enough that he could not ignore her. "Lord Cedric Morcant visited me this morning." Lucien went absolutely still. His expression did not change, but she saw his hands flatten against the desk surface. "What did he say?" "He told me about the riots of 1809, about the civilians who died, about the evidence you buried." Lucien stared at her for exactly 5 seconds. Then he stood, moved to the sideboard, and poured himself a drink. He did not offer her one. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would consider his offer." "Which was? That I leave you quietly before the wedding, or he destroys you publicly after?" Lucien drank the whiskey in one swallow. "Practical man, Cedric. Always was." "That is your response?" Sarcasm? "What response do you want, Serafina? Denial?" "I cannot deny facts. Apologies? I do not apologize for decisions made during wartime." "Begging?" "I do not beg anyone for anything." She stepped closer. "I want the truth. All of it. Because if I am going to stand beside you through whatever hell is coming, I need to know exactly what I am defending." Lucien turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she had arrived at Blackthorn Keep, she saw something raw behind his carefully controlled mask. "The truth is ugly. The truth is that I was 24 years old and my father was dying, and the entire Northern Territory was on fire with riots that threatened to spread into full rebellion. Local authorities were incompetent, Parliament was useless, and I made the decision that survival required force. Overwhelming force. I authorized military intervention with orders to restore order by any means necessary, and 17 people died. 17 people died. Yes, some of them were rioters, some were not. But they all died because I chose control over chaos. And when it was finished, I buried the evidence because I knew that history judges harshly, and I was not willing to let my family's legacy burn because of difficult choices made during impossible circumstances." His voice was flat, factual, completely devoid of emotion. Serafina watched him carefully. "Do you regret it?" Lucien laughed, but it was hollow. "Regret is useless. Regret changes nothing. Those people are still dead. My decisions still stand. Whether I lie awake thinking about it is irrelevant. That is not an answer. It is the only answer you will receive." They stood there in silence while the fire burned low and shadows lengthened across the study walls. Finally, Serafina spoke quietly. "Cedric believes fear is your only weapon, that once people stop fearing you, you will have nothing left." Cedric is correct. Then he has already won. Lucien's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Because fear is fragile, Your Grace. Fear cracks under pressure, but loyalty does not. Respect does not. And if you want to survive what is coming, you need to build something stronger than terror." She turned toward the door. "I will not leave you, Lucien, not because I approve of what you have done, not because I believe you are innocent, but because I made a commitment, and I do not abandon commitments simply because they become difficult. However," she looked back at him, "if you ever lie to me again, if you ever hide truths that affect my life, I will walk away. And no threat from Cedric or anyone else will stop me. Are we clear?" Lucien stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "Crystal." "Good." Serafina left him standing there alone in the darkness. And for the first time in 15 years, Lucien Ravenscar felt something he had trained himself never to feel. Fear of losing someone who mattered. The letter arrived from Cedric exactly 1 week later. "Lucien, your time is expired. I see that Lady Serafina has chosen to remain. Admirable loyalty, though ultimately futile. Tomorrow morning, the London Chronicle will publish the first installment of evidence regarding the Manchester riots. By week's end, every newspaper in England will know the truth. You had your chance to avoid this quietly. Now watch everything you built turn to ash." CM Lucien read it once. Then he walked to Serafina's chambers and knocked. She opened the door still dressed, as if she had been expecting him. "It has begun," he said simply. She nodded. Then we fight. Lucien looked at her, this woman who had every reason to abandon him, who had been offered escape and refused it, and felt something shift inside his chest, something he could not name and did not trust. Why? He asked quietly. Why are you still here? Serafina smiled, but there was steel behind it. Because monsters are only monsters until someone shows them they can be something else. And because I suspect, Your Grace, that beneath all that calculated cruelty is a man who has spent his entire life believing he had no choice but to be ruthless. She stepped closer. But you do have a choice now. You can fight Cedric the way you have always fought, with threats and intimidation and fear. Or you can fight differently. How? By telling the truth yourself, publicly, before he can weaponize it. Lucien stared at her like she had suggested burning down Parliament. That would destroy me just as thoroughly as Cedric's accusations. Perhaps. Or perhaps it would prove that you are strong enough to own your failures instead of hiding them. Either way, Cedric loses his leverage. Outside, snow began falling again, heavy and silent against the windows. Lucien looked into Serafina's eyes and saw something there he had never expected to find in anyone. Trust, not blind, not naive, but real. And in that moment, Duke Lucien Ravenscar made a decision that terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. He would fight for something beyond survival. He would fight for the woman standing in front of him, who believed he could still become more than the monster he had built himself into. Tomorrow, he said quietly, tomorrow we go to London, and we end this. Together? Together. Serafina reached out and placed her hand over his. Then let us show Cedric Morcant what happens when he mistakes fear for weakness. But neither of them could have predicted what was waiting for them in London. Or that by the time the sun rose 3 days later, one of them would be standing over Cedric Morcant's body with blood on their hands, and no memory of how it got there. The carriage ride to London took 2 days through snow that never seemed to stop falling. Lucien sat across from Serafina in silence that felt heavier than the winter pressing against the windows. He watched her read through documents he had given her, every piece of evidence Cedric could possibly use, laid bare without excuses. Financial records, witness statements, military orders bearing his signature. She read it all with the same calm focus she brought to everything, and that terrified him more than any courtroom ever could, because she was choosing to stay after seeing exactly what he was capable of. And Lucien had spent his entire life believing that anyone who truly knew him would run. They arrived in London after midnight. The city sprawled before them like a sleeping beast, all dark streets and frozen Thames and buildings stacked against each other like secrets piled too high. Lucien owned a townhouse in Belgravia, cold marble and empty rooms that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The staff had prepared it in advance, fires burning in every hearth, but the warmth felt manufactured, temporary. Serafina stood in the entrance hall and looked around with the kind of assessment that made servants nervous. How many people know we are here? Only my solicitor and Malcolm Thorne. No one else. Good. Then we have until morning before Cedric realizes we left Blackthorn Keep. She turned to face him fully. What is our strategy? Lucien moved toward the study, gesturing for her to follow. Inside, he had maps of London spread across the desk, marked with locations and names. Cedric's known associates, newspaper offices, Parliament members who could be leveraged or bribed or threatened into silence. Serafina studied the maps for exactly 10 seconds. This is your plan? Intimidation and control? It has worked for 15 years, and it will fail spectacularly now. She pointed to a cluster of marks near Fleet Street. You cannot threaten every newspaper in London simultaneously. The moment one prints the story, the others will follow like wolves smelling blood. Fear only works when people believe you have total control. But Cedric has already proven you do not. Lucien felt something hot and sharp move through his chest. Then what do you suggest? Tell the truth, publicly, before Cedric can weaponize it. We discussed this already. It destroys me either way. No, it destroys the version of you that Cedric expects, the monster who hides behind power and refuses accountability. But if you stand in front of Parliament and admit what happened during the riots, own the decisions, explain the context, accept responsibility, you take away his leverage entirely. Lucien stared at her like she had suggested he cut his own throat in front of witnesses. You want me to confess to authorizing actions that killed civilians. I want you to demonstrate that you are strong enough to face consequences instead of hiding from them. There's a difference between a tyrant who conceals his crimes and a leader who acknowledges difficult choices made during impossible circumstances. She moved closer, voice dropping lower. Cedric believes you are weak beneath the cruelty. Prove him wrong. Show England that the Duke of Ravenscar does not need to hide behind threats, because he has the strength to stand in the light and defend his actions directly. Lucien turned away, staring into the fire burning in the hearth. Every instinct he had spent decades refining screamed that this was suicide. Admitting guilt publicly meant investigations, trials, potential imprisonment. Everything his father had taught him about power said that survival required control, never vulnerability. But Serafina was right about one thing. Fear only worked when people believed you had total control, and Cedric had already shattered that illusion. He looked back at her. If I do this and it fails, we lose everything. If you do nothing, Cedric destroys you tomorrow morning anyway. At least this way you control the narrative. Lucien exhaled slowly. You are either brilliant or insane. Perhaps both. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. Either way, Your Grace, we are committed now. So let us make certain that when the dust settles, it is Cedric Morcant who lies buried beneath it. Outside, London continued sleeping, unaware that by dawn, the entire balance of aristocratic power was about to shift in ways no one could predict. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Lucien drafted a statement with Serafina's input, choosing every word with surgical precision. Not an apology, that would be seen as weakness, but an acknowledgement. Context. A defense that did not deny reality, but reframed it as leadership during crisis. By the time pale light began filtering through the windows, they had something that might actually work, or might destroy him completely. Lucien sent word to 3 members of parliament he trusted, or at least trusted more than the others, requesting an emergency session. Then he dispatched messages to every major newspaper in London, informing them that the Duke of Ravenscar would be making a public statement regarding recent accusations at 10 o'clock that morning in the parliamentary chambers. Serafina watched him work with the same calm focus she had maintained since arriving at Blackthorn Keep, and Lucien found himself wondering, not for the first time, what kind of woman agreed to marry a man like him and then refused to abandon him when the walls started collapsing. At 8 o'clock, Malcolm Thorne arrived with urgent news. Your Grace, Cedric Morcant has already moved. The London Chronicle published their first article an hour ago. He handed over the newspaper. The headline screamed across the front page in bold type, Duke of Ravenscar, implicated in civilian deaths. During 1809 riots, evidence suggests cover-up and political corruption. Lucien read the first paragraph. It was worse than he expected. Not just accusations, but detailed documentation. Names of victims, witness testimonies, financial transactions proving he had paid officials to bury investigations. Everything Cedric had promised to release, now printed for all of London to see. Serafina read over his shoulder, her expression unreadable. This changes nothing, she said quietly. We proceed as planned. They will crucify me before I can speak. Then speak louder. And make certain they remember who you are before they try to bury you. Lucien looked at her. This woman who had known him less than 2 weeks and was already defending him more fiercely than anyone in his entire life, and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his armor, deeper than that. Something he did not have names for, but recognized as dangerous. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. Why fight for someone like me? Serafina held his gaze without wavering. Because I have spent my entire life watching powerful men destroy themselves by refusing to admit they were human. And because I believe you are more than the weapon your father shaped you into. But you need to believe it too, Lucien. Otherwise, Cedric has already won. The clock on the mantel chimed 9. Lucien stood slowly. Then let us show him exactly how wrong he is. The parliamentary chambers were packed by the time they arrived. Lords and ministers crowded every available seat, whispering behind gloved hands, eyes following Lucien with the kind of hunger that only appeared when powerful men smelled blood in the water. The gallery above was filled with journalists, pens already moving across paper, recording everything for tomorrow's editions. Cedric Morcant sat near the front, smiling like a man watching his favorite play unfold exactly as scripted. Lucien walked down the center aisle with Serafina beside him, not behind, beside, and the whispers intensified. Women did not typically attend parliamentary sessions, and her presence made a statement louder than words. She was not hiding, not ashamed, standing with him publicly while every aristocrat in England watched. They reached the speaker's platform. Lord Chancellor Harrington stood at the podium, ancient and humorless, banging his gavel for silence. The chamber will come to order. Duke Ravenscar has requested this emergency session to address accusations published this morning in the London Chronicle. Your Grace, you have the floor. Lucien stepped forward. The room went absolutely silent. He did not look at his notes, did not soften his voice, just spoke with the same iron authority he had used his entire life to command rooms exactly like this one. Members of Parliament, lords, gentlemen, by now you have all read the accusations against me, that during the riots of 1809, I authorized military actions resulting in civilian casualties, that I subsequently paid officials to suppress investigations, that I have concealed these facts for over a decade. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Lucien let it settle before continuing. I stand before you today to confirm that these accusations are accurate. The murmur became a roar. Harrington banged his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in the chamber! Lucien waited until silence returned. I was 24 years old. My father was dying. Northern England was on fire with riots that threatened to spread into full-scale rebellion. Local authorities were overwhelmed. Parliament was paralyzed by debate while cities burned, and I made the decision that order required force. I authorized military intervention with clear instructions: restore stability by any means necessary. His voice did not waver. 17 people died. Some were rioters actively engaged in violence. Others were civilians caught in actions executed with more brutality than precision. And when it was finished, I made another decision. I buried the evidence because I believed that England needed strength more than it needed transparency. I paid witnesses to remain silent. I intimidated officials into closing investigations, not because I lacked courage to face consequences, but because I believed my family's continued power served England's stability better than public scandal. He paused, letting the words land. I was wrong. The chamber erupted. Lords shouted accusations. Ministers demanded immediate arrest. Journalists scribbled frantically in the gallery above. And through it all, Lucy stood perfectly still, waiting for the chaos to exhaust itself. Finally, Harrington managed to restore order again. Your Grace, you understand that this confession opens you to criminal prosecution? I understand completely. Then why make it? Lucien looked directly at Cedric, who had stopped smiling. Because Lord Morcant believed my power depended on concealment, that exposing my failures would destroy me. He was partially correct. My power did depend on control, on fear, on the belief that I was untouchable. He turned back to address the full chamber. But I am not untouchable. I am a man who made difficult decisions during wartime that resulted in tragedy. I am a man who then compounded that tragedy by choosing secrecy over accountability. And I am standing before you now to acknowledge both truths publicly, not because I seek forgiveness, but because I refuse to allow anyone to weaponize truth against me. He stepped forward slightly. If Parliament wishes to investigate, I will cooperate fully. If criminal charges are brought, I will face them. But I will not be destroyed by a man who believes honesty is weakness. Lord Morcant has spent weeks collecting evidence to use as leverage, believing I would crumble when exposed. Instead, I have exposed myself. His leverage is worthless, his threats are empty, and his political games end today. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the chamber turned toward Cedric, who sat frozen in his seat, face pale, jaw tight. Lucien descended from the platform and walked directly toward him, stopping 3 feet away. You wanted to destroy me, Cedric. You failed, because the only power you ever had was information I was afraid to share. And I'm no longer afraid. Cedric stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was ice. You think this is over, Lucien? You think admitting guilt protects you? Parliament will tear you apart. Criminal courts will prosecute. And I will ensure that every detail of your family's corruption follows you into whatever prison they throw you into. Lucien smiled, and it was the coldest thing anyone in that chamber had ever seen. Then do your worst. But remember, once they start investigating Ravenscar finances, they will uncover every transaction, including the ones connecting your family to the same corruption you are so eager to expose. Cedric went very still. You're bluffing. Am I? Shall we test that theory in open court? For exactly 5 seconds, They stared at each other like two wolves deciding which would strike first. Then Cedric turned and walked out of the chamber without another word. The room exploded into chaos behind him. Mike. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Parliament launched 3 separate investigations. Criminal prosecutors opened cases. Newspapers printed editorials demanding everything from Lucien's arrest to his public execution. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Support. Not from aristocrats, they abandoned him immediately, terrified of association with scandal, but from veterans who remembered the chaos of 1809 and understood difficult choices made during wartime. From factory workers who had seen Lucien rebuild villages his father destroyed. From tenant families who suddenly discovered the Duke had been quietly funding schools and hospitals across northern territories for years. Stories began circulating that contradicted the image of a monster hiding crimes. Stories of a man who made harsh decisions but also took responsibility afterward in ways most noblemen never did. Serafina orchestrated much of it, working through networks of women who controlled London's social machinery from behind closed doors. She fed information to sympathetic journalists. She arranged meetings between Lucien and military commanders who could testify to the necessity of his actions during the riots. She turned public opinion slowly but steadily from horror to something more complicated. Not forgiveness. Understanding. And understanding was more powerful than fear ever could be. But Cedric had not finished. 1 week after the parliamentary session, Lucien received word that Cedric had been found dead in his Mayfair townhouse. Stabbed 3 times in the chest. No witnesses. No obvious signs of forced entry. And the last person seen visiting him alive had been carrying a letter sealed with the Ravenscar crest. The constables arrived at Lucien's townhouse before dawn. 6 of them, led by a grim-faced inspector named Whitmore, who looked like he had spent his entire career waiting for an opportunity to arrest a duke. Your Grace, I need you to accompany us to the station for questioning regarding the murder of Lord Cedric Morcant. Lucien stood in the doorway, still dressed from the night before, eyes cold. On what grounds? A witness reports seeing someone matching your description leaving Morcant's residence shortly before his body was discovered. Additionally, a letter bearing your family seal was found near the body. I was here all evening. My wife can confirm that. Serafina appeared beside him, wrapped in a robe, hair loose around her shoulders. My husband did not leave this house last night, Inspector. Whitmore's expression did not change. With respect, Your Grace, spousal testimony is not considered reliable in murder investigations. I will need independent verification. Lucien stepped forward slightly. Are you arresting me, Inspector? Not yet. But I strongly suggest you cooperate voluntarily before this becomes more difficult for everyone involved. Lucien looked at Serafina. She held his gaze steadily, and something passed between them that had no words attached. Fine. I will accompany you. But I want my solicitor present for all questioning. Of course, Your Grace. They took him away in an unmarked carriage while Serafina stood in the doorway watching, face unreadable. The moment they disappeared into London's morning fog, she turned and walked directly to Malcolm Thorne's study. We have a serious problem, she said quietly, and we have very little time to solve it. Beset. The interrogation room was exactly as cold as Lucien expected. Stone walls, single lamp casting harsh shadows. A table between him and Inspector Whitmore, who spread documents across the surface with deliberate slowness. Your Grace, let us begin with your relationship with Lord Morcant. We were acquaintances, rivals, more accurately, and you had reason to wish him harm. Everyone in London had reason to wish Cedric Morcant harm. He made a career of destroying people. Yet, you had specific motivation. He attempted to blackmail you, publicly humiliated you, cost you political alliances and social standing. He attempted to destroy me, yes. He failed. Did he? Because, from where I sit, Your Grace, it appears he succeeded quite thoroughly, and then, conveniently, he turned up dead. Lucien leaned back in his chair, expression bored. If I wanted Cedric dead, Inspector, he would have died years ago, quietly, without witnesses or evidence pointing back to me. I have resources you cannot imagine and connections that reach into places you will never see. Murdering him clumsily in his own home and leaving my family's seal at the scene is beneath my competence. Whitmore smiled thinly. Perhaps, or perhaps you were angry. Perhaps you acted impulsively. Perhaps for the first time in your life, the great Duke of Ravenscar made a mistake. Lucien held his gaze without blinking. I do not make mistakes, Inspector. I make decisions, and I did not decide to kill Cedric Morcant. Then explain the witness who saw you leaving his residence. I was not there. Your witness is either mistaken or lying. And the letter? I sent no letter to Cedric Morcant. If one bearing my seal was found at the scene, someone planted it deliberately to implicate me. Whitmore leaned forward. Who would do that, Your Grace? Who benefits from framing you for murder? Lucien felt something cold spread through his chest because he did not have an answer. And that terrified him more than the interrogation itself. Because someone had killed Cedric. Someone had used Lucien's seal. Someone wanted him destroyed not just politically, but criminally, and he had no idea who. They held him for 6 hours before his solicitor, a shark named Edmund Price, who had defended half of London's aristocracy from various scandals, finally secured his release on grounds of insufficient evidence. But the damage was done. Newspapers screamed about the Duke of Ravenscar being questioned for murder. Parliament whispered about criminal prosecution. And every enemy Lucien had accumulated over 15 years suddenly smelled opportunity. He returned to the townhouse to find Serafina waiting in the study, surrounded by papers and documents spread across every available surface. She looked up when he entered. You did not kill him. It was not a question. No. But someone wants it to appear that you did. Obviously. Lucien poured himself a drink, exhaustion pulling at him in ways he had not felt in years. Who? Serafina asked quietly. Who benefits from both Cedric's death and your arrest? Lucien turned to face her. That is what terrifies me. Because the only people with sufficient motivation are the ones I already destroyed. Cedric was my last significant enemy in London. Everyone else either fears me or needs me too much to move against me this openly. Unless it is not about politics at all. What do you mean? Serafina stood and crossed to the window, staring out into London's dark streets. What if this is personal? What if someone wants revenge not for political reasons, but for something deeper? Something connected to those 17 civilians who died during the riots? Lucien went very still. That was 13 years ago. Anyone seeking revenge would have acted long before now. Not if they were waiting for the right moment. Not if they needed you vulnerable first. She turned back to face him. Cedric exposed your past publicly. Made you confess before Parliament. Turned you from untouchable into target. What if someone used that chaos to finally act on a grudge they have been carrying for over a decade? Lucien felt his mind racing through possibilities, connections, names from 13 years ago that he had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten they existed. If you are correct, then we need to find out who before they strike again. Because if someone framed me for Cedric's murder, they are not finished. What makes you think there is more? Because revenge is never satisfied with half measures. Whoever did this wants me completely destroyed, dead, imprisoned, or so thoroughly ruined that the Ravenscar name disappears entirely. He set down his glass and moved toward the desk where Serafina had been working. What did you find while I was being interrogated? She gestured toward one particular stack of papers. Letters. Between Cedric and someone using the initial M. No full name, no address. But the content suggests they were planning something together. Something that required precise timing and access to information Cedric should not have possessed. Lucien picked up one of the letters and read it quickly. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, completely unfamiliar, but the content was damning. References to evidence, discussions of leverage, and one sentence that made his blood run cold. When the Duke falls, we will both have what we deserve. Who is M? Serafina asked. Lucien stared at the letter, mind churning through every name, every connection, every possibility. And then, like ice water down his spine, he remembered. Margaret Ashford. Who? The widow of Captain James Ashford. He died during the riots in 1809, one of the 17 casualties. Serafina's eyes widened. She has been planning this for 13 years? Lucien nodded slowly. James Ashford was not just any casualty. He was a decorated military officer, respected, connected, and he died because my orders put him in a situation where local soldiers panicked and opened fire indiscriminately. Margaret blamed me publicly at the time, but then she disappeared. I assumed she left London entirely. Clearly she did not. And clearly she has been waiting. Lucien looked at Serafina. We need to find her, now, before she finishes whatever she started. But they were already too late. Because at that exact moment, Across London, in a rented room near Whitechapel, Margaret Ashford was writing one final letter. Not to Lucien, to Seraphina. And when it arrived the next morning, sealed in black wax and delivered by anonymous courier, the words inside would force a choice that neither of them could walk away from. Lady Seraphina. By now, you know that I killed Cedric Morcant and framed your husband for murder. You know that I have waited 13 years for justice. What you do not know is that I have one final move prepared. Tomorrow at noon, I will be at Westminster Bridge. Come alone, or I will ensure that every piece of evidence connecting Lucien to Cedric's death becomes public. He will hang for a murder he did not commit. But if you come, if you face me without guards or constables or the Duke's protection, I will tell you everything. Who helped me, how I obtained the seal, and most importantly, the real reason your husband authorized those deaths 13 years ago. The reason he has spent his entire life hiding. You have until noon tomorrow to decide if you love him enough to risk discovering the truth. Margaret Ashford. Seraphina read the letter 3 times. Then she burned it in the fireplace and did not tell Lucien anything at all, because some choices required walking into darkness alone, and some truths were too dangerous to share until you knew whether they would save someone or destroy them completely. Westminster Bridge stood empty at 11:45 in the morning, wind cutting across the Thames like a blade made from winter itself. Seraphina arrived alone as instructed, wrapped in a dark cloak that did nothing to stop the cold from settling into her bones. She had told no one where she was going, not Lucien, not Malcolm Thorne, not even the household staff who would have noticed her leaving through the servants' entrance before dawn, because some truths required facing alone, and some lies could only be exposed when no one else was watching. She walked to the center of the bridge and stopped, hands gripping the stone railing, eyes scanning the emptiness for any sign of Margaret Ashford. The city moved around her, carriages rumbling past, merchants shouting from nearby markets. The constant background noise of London existing without caring who lived or died within its boundaries. But here, suspended above dark water with nothing but silence and wind, Seraphina felt like she had stepped outside the world entirely, waiting for a woman who had spent 13 years planning revenge, waiting to discover whether the man she had married was exactly the monster everyone believed him to be, or something worse. The church bells struck noon. A voice came from behind her, soft and controlled. Lady Seraphina, how brave of you to come alone, or how foolish. I have not decided which yet. Seraphina turned slowly. Margaret Ashford stood 15 feet away, dressed in mourning black despite 13 years having passed since her husband's death. 40 years old, dark hair streaked with gray, face carved into angles that spoke of grief hardened into purpose. She was not beautiful, not elegant, just relentlessly present in the way people became when they had nothing left to lose. Seraphina kept her voice steady. You promised answers if I came without guards. I am here. So speak, Mrs. Ashford. Tell me why you killed Cedric Morcant and framed my husband for murder. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Straight to business. I expected nothing less from a woman intelligent enough to survive marriage to Lucien Ravenscar. Very well. I will give you what you came for. She moved closer, stopping just outside arm's reach. I killed Cedric because he was useful until he was not. He provided access to documents I needed, connections inside aristocratic circles I could never penetrate alone. He believed we were partners seeking mutual revenge against your husband. But Cedric was motivated by political ambition. He wanted to destroy Lucien to claim power for himself. And you? I wanted justice for my husband's murder. Lucien did not murder your husband. He authorized military intervention during riots. Your husband died in the chaos. Margaret's expression went cold as frozen stone. My husband died because Lucien Ravenscar gave orders knowing they would result in civilian casualties and did not care. James was not a rioter. He was an officer attempting to negotiate peace when soldiers under your husband's command opened fire indiscriminately. He bled to death in a gutter while Lucien was safe in his estate, calculating how to bury the evidence. Seraphina felt something twist in her chest, but kept her face neutral. If you wanted justice, why not go through legal channels? Why wait 13 years? Because legal channels protect men like Lucien Ravenscar. Because power insulates aristocrats from consequences. And because I needed him vulnerable first. I needed him exposed, weakened, desperate. Only then could I truly destroy him. By framing him for murder. By ensuring he hangs for a crime the entire city believes he committed. Yes, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of the Thames, rot in industry and human waste flowing endlessly toward the sea. Serafina studied Margaret carefully. You said in your letter that you would tell me who helped you, how you obtained the Ravenscar seal, and the real reason Lucien authorized those deaths. I came for answers, Mrs. Ashford, so give them to me. Margaret reached into her cloak and pulled out a small leather pouch. She opened it and withdrew a signet ring bearing the Ravenscar crest. She held it up to the gray light. This is how I sealed the letter left at Cedric's body. Your husband's family ring, the one his father wore before him. Recognize it? Serafina's blood went cold. That ring was locked in Lucien's private study. Only he and Malcolm Thorne have access. Margaret's smile widened. Exactly. The implication landed like a fist to the stomach. No. Malcolm has served the Ravenscar family for 30 years. He would never betray his master? Never seek revenge for sins committed long before you arrived? How certain are you, Lady Serafina? How well do you truly know the people surrounding your husband? Serafina's mind raced through memories, conversations, small moments she had dismissed as insignificant. Malcolm's careful distance, his precise loyalty that never quite reached warmth, the way he watched Lucien sometimes when he thought no one was looking, not with devotion but with something colder, more patient. You are lying. Am I? Then ask yourself this. Who had access to documents proving Lucien's involvement in the riots? Who managed the estate records for decades? Who could move through Blackthorn Keep without suspicion? Who knew every secret the Ravenscar family ever buried? She stepped closer. Malcolm Thorne gave me everything I needed. Not because I forced him, because he wanted Lucien destroyed as much as I did. Why? Margaret's expression shifted into something almost pitying. Because Malcolm Thorne's younger brother was one of the 17 civilians killed during those riots. A factory worker in the wrong place at the wrong time when soldiers opened fire. Malcolm buried his grief beneath perfect service for 13 years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when I approached him 2 years ago with my plan, he agreed immediately. Serafina felt the world tilting beneath her feet. If Malcolm wanted revenge, why not act sooner? Why wait until now? Because revenge only matters if the target understands what they have lost. Malcolm wanted Lucien to build something worth destroying. A legacy, a marriage, a future. And then he wanted to watch it all collapse, while Lucien realized the man who orchestrated his downfall was someone he trusted completely. The cruelty of it was perfect, methodical, patient in ways that only true hatred could sustain. Serafina forced herself to think past the shock. You said you would tell me the real reason Lucien authorized those deaths. So tell me. No more games. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and something in her eyes shifted from triumph to something darker. Your husband did not give those orders because he believed they were necessary for England's stability. He gave them because his father demanded it. Because the old Duke wanted to prove that Lucien was ruthless enough to inherit the title without hesitation. The riots were a test, Lady Serafina. And your husband passed by authorizing actions that killed innocent people to satisfy his father's approval. Serafina felt like she had been struck. You have proof of this? Margaret reached into her cloak again and withdrew a folded document. She handed it over. A letter from the old Duke to Lucien, written 3 days before the military intervention. Read it yourself. Serafina unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The handwriting was harsh, angular, belonging to someone who viewed words as weapons. Lucien, the Northern Territories are in chaos. You have requested permission to authorize military force. I am granting it not because England requires it, but because I require proof that you are capable of making decisions that will haunt you. Weak men hesitate. Strong men act regardless of cost. If you cannot order deaths necessary to maintain power, then you are not worthy of the Ravenscar name. Do not disappoint me. Father. Serafina read it 3 times, feeling something inside her chest crack with each pass. Lucien had spent his entire life believing he made that decision for England's survival. But it had been performance for a dying tyrant who measured strength by body count. Margaret watched her carefully. Now you understand. Your husband is not a monster because circumstances forced impossible choices. He is a monster because he chose to become one to satisfy a father who valued cruelty over humanity. And he has spent 13 years hiding that truth beneath justifications about duty and necessity. Serafina looked up slowly. Why tell me this? Why not simply let Lucien hang for Cedric's murder and be done with it? Because I want him to know that he lost everything because of choices he made trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. I want him to understand that his entire life was built on a foundation of weakness disguised as strength. And I want you, the woman he has allowed himself to care about, to be the one who delivers that truth. Margaret stepped back toward the edge of the bridge. You have a choice now, Lady Serafina. You can take that letter to Lucien, show him proof that his father manipulated him into becoming a killer. Watch him realize that everything he believed about himself was a lie. Or you can burn it, protect him from the truth, and spend the rest of your life wondering if the man you married is capable of change or simply very good at convincing people he is more than a weapon. She turned to leave. Either way, Malcolm and I have already won. The evidence framing Lucien for murder is secure. The constables will arrest him again within days. And this time, there will be no political maneuvering or aristocratic influence that can save him. He will hang for Cedric Morcant's death, and the Ravenscar name will die with him. Wait, Margaret paused but did not turn back. Where's Malcolm now? Margaret's voice carried across the wind. Where he has always been, at Lucien's side, waiting to watch him fall. Then she was gone, disappearing into London's grey morning like smoke dissolving into fog. Serafina stood alone on Westminster Bridge, holding a letter that could destroy everything Lucien believed about himself, and felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her shoulders. Tell him the truth and shatter whatever remained of his identity, or hide it and allow him to face execution believing he had been strong when he had only been manipulated. Some decisions had no right answers, only different kinds of devastation. She returned to the townhouse an hour later to find chaos. Constables surrounded the building, carriages blocked the street, and through the windows she could see Lucien being questioned again, this time with Inspector Whitmore holding documents that looked far more damning than anything produced during the first interrogation. Serafina pushed through the crowd and entered to find Malcolm Thorne standing near the study doorway, face carefully neutral, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of perfect servitude he had maintained for 3 decades. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Serafina saw it. The cold satisfaction barely concealed beneath decades of disciplined loyalty. The patient hatred that had waited 13 years for this exact moment. The man who had served the Ravenscar family while planning its complete destruction. Malcolm smiled very slightly. My lady. What unfortunate timing. The inspector has discovered new evidence linking his grace to Lord Morcant's murder. I'm afraid this time they will not release him. Serafina walked past him without responding, moving directly into the study where Lucien stood rigid and furious while Whitmore laid out photographs and witness statements across the desk. The inspector looked up. Lady Serafina, I must ask you to leave. This is official police business. She ignored him and looked at Lucien. We need to talk, privately. Not now, Serafina, now. Something in her voice made him pause. He studied her face, saw something there that made his expression shift from anger to concern. He turned to Whitmore. Give us 5 minutes. Your Grace, I cannot. 5 minutes, Inspector, or I will have my solicitor bury you in procedural delays that will stretch this investigation into next year. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he gestured to his men to step outside. 5 minutes, no more. The room emptied. Serafina waited until the door closed before speaking. Malcolm betrayed you. Lucien went very still. Explain. Margaret Ashford was not working alone. Malcolm has been helping her for years. He gave her access to estate documents. He provided the ring used to seal the letter found at Cedric's body. He has been orchestrating your destruction since before I ever arrived at Blackthorn Keep. The color drained from Lucien's face. That is impossible. Malcolm has served my family since before I was born. His younger brother died during the riots of 1809, one of the 17 civilians. Malcolm has spent 13 years waiting for the perfect moment to destroy you in revenge. Lucien turned away, hands bracing against the desk, breathing hard. James Thorne. I remember now. Factory worker, wrong place, wrong time. Malcolm never spoke of him after the riots. I assumed he had made peace with it. He made nothing resembling peace. He made plans. Serafina moved closer. But there is more. Something worse. She pulled out the letter Margaret had given her and set it on the desk between them. Read it. Lucien looked at the paper like it might burn him. Then he picked it up and read slowly, expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like his entire foundation cracking. When he finished, he set it down very carefully. My father. Yes, his voice was hollow. He turned the riots into a test, forced me to authorize deaths to prove I was ruthless enough to inherit. And I spent 13 years believing I made that decision for England's survival when it was only ever about satisfying his approval. Serafina watched him process it, watched the man who had built his entire identity on strength and control, realize that his defining moment had been manipulation by someone incapable of love. The silence stretched between them like a chasm opening in real time. Finally, Lucien spoke quietly. Margaret and Malcolm planned all of this. The exposure, the confession, the murder. Everything designed to destroy me at the moment when I finally allowed myself to believe I could be more than what my father shaped me into. Yes. And they succeeded. Not yet. Serafina stepped directly in front of him. They succeeded in exposing your past. They succeeded in framing you for murder, but they have not succeeded in destroying you, not unless you let them. Lucien looked at her with eyes that had gone cold again, retreating behind walls he had spent weeks learning to lower. What choice do I have, Serafina? The evidence against me is overwhelming. Malcolm has ensured that every piece points directly to my guilt. The constables will arrest me, courts will prosecute, and I will hang for a murder I did not commit, while the man who actually orchestrated it watches from a position of perfect trust. Then we expose him first. How? Malcolm has spent decades building credibility. His loyalty is legendary. Who will believe us? Serafina pulled out a second document she had taken from Margaret, a signed confession detailing Malcolm's involvement, insurance Margaret had kept in case her partner ever betrayed her. Margaret wrote down everything Malcolm did, every document he stole, every piece of evidence he planted. She kept it as leverage against him. Why would she give that to you? Because she wanted me to have a choice. Protect you by exposing Malcolm, or let you hang while believing your destruction came from external enemies instead of internal betrayal. Lucien stared at the confession. If we use this, Margaret goes free. She killed Cedric, framed me, and walks away without consequences. Yes. Serafina held his gaze. So you have to decide what matters more. Justice for Cedric's murder, or survival for yourself. Revenge against Margaret, or protection against Malcolm. You cannot have both. The door opened. Inspector Whitmore stepped inside. Time is up, Your Grace. I am placing you under formal arrest for the murder of Lord Cedric Morcant. You will be taken into custody immediately pending trial. Two constables moved forward. Lucien looked at Serafina one last time, and in that moment she saw something she had never seen before in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, surrender. The realization that he had spent his entire life fighting to maintain control, and control had never existed at all. That every decision he made believing it was strength had been weakness. That the fortress he built around himself had been prison, and the only person who had ever tried to show him a way out was standing in front of him holding evidence that could save him only if he admitted that survival required sacrifice. He turned to Whitmore. Wait. Then he looked at Malcolm, who stood in the doorway watching with satisfaction barely concealed beneath perfect composure. Lucien's voice was ice. Malcolm Thorne, you are dismissed from my service, effective immediately. Malcolm's expression did not change. Your Grace, I do not understand. Serafina stepped forward and handed the confession directly to Inspector Whitmore. Inspector, I believe you will find this document relevant to your investigation. It is a signed statement detailing how Malcolm Thorne conspired with Margaret Ashford to murder Lord Morcant and frame my husband, including specific descriptions of evidence he planted, documents he stole, and actions he took to ensure the Duke's arrest. Whitmore read quickly, expression shifting from skepticism to shock. He looked at Malcolm. Is this true? Malcolm's face went blank. Not with surprise, with calculation. The look of a man who had prepared contingencies for exactly this scenario. He smiled coldly. You have no proof beyond a document written by a murderer seeking to deflect blame. My service to the Ravenscar family is documented across 3 decades. Who will courts believe? A trusted servant or a desperate duchess trying to save her husband from execution? Serafina's voice was steel. They will believe the servant who just made a critical mistake. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. What mistake? Serafina gestured toward the study window. where two men stood watching from across the street. Journalists she had sent anonymous messages to early that morning, tipping them to be present when the truth emerged. "You are being recorded, Mr. Thorne. Every word. And the moment you threatened to discredit me, you confirmed exactly what that confession states, that you are willing to manipulate truth to protect yourself." Malcolm's composure cracked. "You have no authority to—" Inspector Whitmore cut him off. "Malcolm Thorne, I am placing you under arrest as an accessory to murder. You will accompany us to the station for questioning immediately." Constables moved forward. Malcolm did not resist, but as they escorted him past Lucien, he stopped and spoke quietly. "I waited 13 years for this, Your Grace. 13 years watching you build power on my brother's grave. And even now, even facing arrest, I would do it again. Because you needed to know what it feels like to lose everything while the people you trust smile and watch you burn." Lucien held his gaze. "I know exactly what that feels like, Malcolm. Because I spent 35 years believing my father loved me when he only ever saw me as a tool to be sharpened. And the difference between us is that I am choosing to become something other than the weapon he created. You are choosing to remain exactly what grief shaped you into. Hate is easier than healing, but it destroys you long before it touches your enemies." Malcolm was silent. Then the constables took him away. Attack. The investigation that followed was brutal and public. Malcolm confessed under interrogation, confirming everything in Margaret's document and adding details that made the conspiracy even more damning. Margaret was arrested 3 days later, attempting to board a ship to France. Both faced trial for murder and conspiracy. Lucien was exonerated completely, but exoneration did not erase the damage. Parliament remained skeptical. Aristocrats maintained distance. The Ravenscar name carried stains that no legal verdict could wash away. And through it all, Lucien withdrew into himself in ways that terrified Serafina more than any external threat, because she had shown him the letter from his father, and he had not spoken about it since. 1 month after Malcolm's arrest, she found Lucien standing in the ruins of his study, surrounded by documents and family records he had been burning methodically in the fireplace. His father's letters, estate records from the riots, everything connected to the man who had shaped him into a weapon. Serafina stopped in the doorway. "Lucien." He did not turn around. "I spent my entire life believing I was strong, that every cruel decision I made was necessary, that power required sacrifice and strength meant never showing weakness. And it was all performance for a man who measured love by how thoroughly I destroyed my own humanity." He threw another letter into the flames. "Malcolm was right. I built everything on graves. And the worst part is that I convinced myself it was justified." Serafina crossed the room and stood beside him. "Then stop building on graves. Start building something else." Lucien finally looked at her. "I do not know how." "Then learn. The same way I learned how to survive London without protection. The same way you learned how to tell the truth in Parliament when every instinct said to hide. We figure it out together." He was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Why did you stay, Serafina? After everything you learned, after seeing exactly what I am capable of, why did you not leave when you had the chance? Because I saw something in you that you refused to see in yourself. Which is that you are not your father's weapon. You are a man capable of change, but only if you choose it. Only if you stop believing that strength means never admitting you were wrong." She reached out and took his hand. "And because I would rather fight beside someone trying to become better than stand safely beside someone who believes they are already perfect." Lucien looked down at their joined hands. "I do not deserve you." "Probably not, but you are stuck with me anyway." He smiled, and it was the first genuine expression she had seen on his face in weeks. Outside, London continued existing without caring whether the Duke of Ravenscar survived or fell. But inside that study, surrounded by ashes of a legacy he was finally willing to burn, Lucien Ravenscar made a choice that his father never would have understood. He chose to be weak enough to need someone, and that made him stronger than he had ever been before. Eat their seats. But that night, as Serafina slept, a letter arrived by anonymous courier. No seal, no signature, just words written in handwriting she did not recognize. "Lady Serafina, you saved your husband from Malcolm's revenge. Congratulations. But you should know that Margaret Ashford was not the only widow seeking justice. There are 16 other families who lost someone during those riots, and we have been watching. Your husband believes this is over, It has only just begun. Sleep well, Duchess. Serafina burned the letter before Lucien could see it, because some threats required facing alone, and some wars never truly ended. They just waited for the right moment to begin again. The letter had been written by someone who understood exactly how to twist a blade already buried deep. Serafina read it again in the darkness of her chambers, memorizing every word while Lucien slept fitfully in the room beside hers. They had maintained separate quarters since returning from London. His decision, not hers, made without explanation but loaded with the kind of distance that spoke louder than any conversation. 16 families. 16 people who had spent 13 years carrying grief that calcified into purpose. And they were watching. Serafina stood and moved to the window, staring out across Blackthorn Keep's frozen grounds toward forests that swallowed moonlight without reflection. The castle felt different now, less like a fortress and more like a target. Every shadow held potential threat. Every servant could be an informant. Every delivery could carry poison or blades or accusations wrapped in parchment. Power had always been about control, but control was an illusion that shattered the moment someone stopped fearing you. And 16 families no longer feared the Duke of Ravenscar. They had watched him confess publicly, watched him stand trial, watched him survive only because his wife produced evidence at the last possible moment. And in that survival, they saw weakness, vulnerability. Proof that the monster who had haunted their nightmares for over a decade could bleed, so they would make him bleed more. Serafina folded the letter carefully and fed it into the dying embers of her fireplace, watching it curl into ash. She could tell Lucien, should tell him, but he was already fracturing under the weight of truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Adding another threat might push him past the point where he could function at all. And they needed him functional, because whatever was coming required both of them sharp and ready. She dressed quickly in riding clothes, boots laced tight, cloak heavy across her shoulders. Then she left through the servants' entrance and walked directly to the stables, moving with the kind of confidence that made guards assume she had permission to be there. She saddled a horse herself and rode hard into the darkness, toward the village of Ashenmoor, 15 miles east, where the families of the 17 dead had built their lives after the riots destroyed everything else. If war was coming, she would meet it on her terms, not as a duchess waiting for enemies to strike, but as a woman willing to walk directly into the fire and negotiate before it consumed everything she had fought to protect. Because that was what strength looked like when you stopped believing power meant never showing your throat. Sometimes strength meant exposing vulnerability deliberately, and using it as a weapon sharper than any blade. Ashenmoor existed in perpetual gray, not quite abandoned, but never thriving. Stone cottages clustered around a church that looked older than England itself. Streets empty except for shadows and the occasional dog scavenging through refuse. The kind of place people ended up when London spat them out and nowhere else would take them in. Serafina rode through the village center as dawn broke pale and cold across the horizon. A few faces appeared in windows, watching her pass with expressions that mixed curiosity and hostility. They knew who she was. The cloak could not hide quality fabric. The horse could not disguise aristocratic breeding. And her face had been in enough newspapers that recognition was inevitable. She stopped in front of the largest building, a meeting hall that doubled as tavern and town center. Dismounted, walked directly to the door and pushed it open without knocking. Inside, 15 people sat around a long wooden table, men and women ranging from 30 to 60, all dressed in working clothes worn thin from years of labor. They looked up as she entered, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Serafina removed her cloak and folded it over one arm. "My name is Lady Serafina Ravenscar. I am here because one of you sent me a letter last night threatening my husband, and I would like to discuss terms before this escalates into violence that will destroy all of us." A woman at the far end of the table stood slowly, 50 years old, gray hair pulled back severely, hands weathered from factory work. Her voice was rough as broken glass. "You have courage, Duchess. Walking into a room filled with people who have every reason to hate you. Or perhaps you are simply stupid." Serafina held her gaze without blinking. "Neither. I am practical, and I understand that revenge is easier to plan than execute. You want justice for loved ones who died during the riots, but killing my husband will not bring them back. It will only ensure that you all hang alongside him." A man near the center of the table laughed bitterly. "We are already dead, Lady Serafina. We died the day your husband authorized soldiers to open fire on civilians. Everything since has been borrowed time. Then why waste that borrowed time on vengeance that accomplishes nothing? Another woman spoke up, younger, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Because he needs to pay. Because monsters do not get to confess publicly and walk away into comfortable lives while we bury children and spouses and parents. Because the world needs to know that aristocrats are not untouchable. Serafina stepped closer to the table. My husband has paid. He stood before Parliament and admitted his role in those deaths. He faced criminal prosecution. He lost political alliances and social standing. His name is ruined across England. What more do you want from him? His life, the gray-haired woman said flatly. We want him to know what it feels like to have everything stripped away by someone else's decision. We want him afraid, we want him suffering, and then we want him dead. The room murmured agreement. Serafina felt her pulse quicken but kept her voice steady. And what happens after? You kill the Duke of Ravenscar, and then what? You become martyrs for a cause that most of England will dismiss as criminal violence. Your families suffer. Your children grow up knowing their parents were executed for murder. And the system that allowed those riots to happen continues unchanged because you destroyed the one man who actually stood up and admitted fault. The gray-haired woman's eyes narrowed. You defend him very passionately for someone who has only known him months. I defend him because he is trying to become better than what his father shaped him into, and because destroying him now will not create justice. It will only perpetuate the same cycle of violence and revenge that has poisoned this country for generations. She pulled out a document from her cloak, a detailed plan she had drafted overnight. I am offering you an alternative. My husband has significant resources, land, money, political influence that still carries weight in certain circles. What if instead of killing him, you allowed him to make genuine reparations? Establish funds for education and employment training. Build infrastructure in communities devastated by the riots. Create opportunities for the children of those who died to have futures their parents never could. The man who had laughed earlier shook his head. Money is not justice. No. But it is survival, and survival allows you to build something lasting instead of dying for a moment of satisfaction. The room fell silent again. The gray-haired woman studied Serafina with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be easily swayed by words. Why should we trust that your husband would follow through? Why believe that this is not simply another manipulation to buy time? Because I will ensure it happens. Personally, I will oversee every fund established, monitor every project built, and if my husband fails to honor these commitments, I will return here myself and hand you the evidence necessary to destroy him legally and completely. She set the document on the table. This is not mercy. This is pragmatism. You can have revenge and die, or you can have reparations and live to see your family's benefit. Choose. The silence stretched until it felt like the room itself was holding breath. Finally, a man at the corner spoke. Older, scarred across one side of his face, voice carrying weight that suggested leadership. You risk much coming here alone, Duchess, making promises you cannot guarantee, trusting us not to kill you where you stand and then kill your husband anyway. Yes, Serafina said simply. I do. Because I believe that most people prefer building to destroying when given the choice, and because I am gambling that you are better than the man who took your loved ones from you. The scarred man stood slowly and walked around the table until he was directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the details of old wounds across his face, close enough to kill her if he chose. He studied her for exactly 10 seconds. Then he picked up the document and began reading. We will consider your proposal. You have 1 week to return with contracts and legal guarantees. If your husband agrees and honors these terms, we will cease hostilities. If he refuses or betrays this agreement, we will destroy him in ways that make Malcolm Thorne's revenge look merciful. He handed the document back. Now leave before we change our minds. Serafina took it without hesitation, met his eyes one last time, and walked out of that building without looking back. Because fear was weakness, and weakness got you killed. She returned to Blackthorn Keep 3 hours later to find Lucien standing in the courtyard, face carved from ice and fury, surrounded by guards. Where the hell were you? His voice carried across the stones like a whip crack. Serafina dismounted and handed the reins to a stable boy. Solving problems you were too broken to address yourself. She walked past him toward the main entrance. Lucien followed, anger radiating off him in waves. You left without guards, without telling anyone where you were going. Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? They reached her chambers, and she turned to face him. I went to Ashenmore, to the families of the 17 people who died during the riots, the ones currently planning to kill you. Lucien went absolutely still. You did what? I negotiated terms. Reparations in exchange for peace, education funds, infrastructure development, opportunities for communities you destroyed, all documented, all legally binding, all contingent on you agreeing and following through. She threw the proposal onto the nearest table. You have 1 week to decide if you want to live or die, because those are your options now. Make amends or face assassination. Choose. Lucien stared at her like she had lost her mind. You had no authority to negotiate on my behalf, no right to promise resources without consultation, and absolutely no business walking into a room filled with people who want me dead and offering them anything except your own throat to cut. Serafina stepped closer, voice dropping to something cold and sharp. I had every right because you were too busy drowning in self-pity to see the threat coming. Those families do not want your apologies, Lucien. They want blood. And the only reason you are still breathing is because I convinced them that your survival serves them better than your death. So you are welcome. The fury in Lucien's eyes shifted into something more complicated. Surprise, gratitude, fear, all tangled together beneath the iron control he used to mask everything. Why? He asked quietly. Why risk yourself like that? Because someone has to fight for you when you have forgotten how to fight for yourself. She turned away, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Read the proposal, make your decision, but understand this. If you refuse, I am done. I will not stand beside a man who chooses pride over survival. I will not watch you destroy yourself because you cannot accept that redemption requires humility. Lucien was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the document and left without another word. He spent 3 days locked in his study, reviewing contracts and financial projections, consulting with solicitors, running calculations on how much the proposed reparations would cost, and whether the Ravenscar estates could sustain them long term. And through it all, Serafina waited, maintaining distance that felt more like abandonment than strategy, because sometimes people needed to make choices alone, without influence, without pressure, without anyone to blame except themselves. On the 4th day, Lucien emerged and found her in the library, reading by firelight. He sat down across from her without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he said quietly, I spent my entire life believing that admitting fault was weakness, that powerful men did not apologize because apologies acknowledged vulnerability, and vulnerability invited attack. He looked at the flames burning in the hearth. But you walked into a room filled with my enemies and offered them vulnerability deliberately, used it as negotiation, turned weakness into strength by refusing to pretend it did not exist. Serafina closed her book. And I agree to the terms, all of them. I will establish the funds, oversee the infrastructure projects, provide opportunities for families I destroyed, not because I believe it erases what happened, but because it is the only path forward that does not end with more death. He met her eyes. You were right. Redemption requires humility, and I would rather be humiliated alive than proud and dead. Serafina smiled slightly. That might be the first intelligent thing you have said in weeks. Lucien almost laughed. Do not get used to it. But something in his expression shifted, became more serious. Serafina, why did you really go to Ashenmore alone? The truth. Not the pragmatic answer about solving problems. The real reason. She was quiet for several seconds. Because I have spent my entire life watching powerful men make decisions that affect everyone around them without ever facing consequences directly. And I was tired of it. Tired of watching people suffer while aristocrats hide behind titles and money. So I decided that if we were going to survive this, we needed to face it differently. Together. Without barriers. Without the distance that power creates between people and reality. She leaned forward slightly. You needed to see that vulnerability is not weakness, and I needed to prove to myself that I was strong enough to stand between you and violence without flinching. Lucien stared at her with something that looked like awe mixed with terror. You are either the bravest person I have ever met or the most reckless. Probably both. She stood and moved toward the door. We leave for Ashenmore tomorrow morning. Together. You will sign the contracts in front of the families. Look them in the eyes. Acknowledge their suffering directly. And then we will begin the work of actually making these commitments real instead of empty promises. Lucien nodded slowly. And if they kill me anyway? Then at least you died trying to be better than you were. She paused in the doorway. But I do not think they will. Because most people do not actually want revenge. They want acknowledgement, recognition that their suffering mattered, and you are about to give them exactly that. The ride to Ashenmore felt like traveling toward an execution. Cold wind, gray skies, roads frozen solid beneath the horses' hooves. Lucien rode in silence beside Serafina, jaw tight, eyes focused on the horizon with the kind of intensity that came from preparing for battle, because that was what this was. Not a physical battle, but something harder, more terrifying, the kind of fight that required stripping away armor instead of putting it on. Walking into a room filled with people who hated you and offering nothing except honesty and willingness to be destroyed if that was what justice required. Men who lived by control did not survive moments like this. Only men willing to surrender control had any chance at all. They reached Ashenmore as midday light turned everything pale and washed out. The village looked even more desolate in daylight. Empty streets, closed doors, silence that felt heavy with anticipation. They dismounted in front of the meeting hall. Serafina looked at Lucien. Are you ready? No. Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. She pushed open the door and they entered together. The same 15 people sat around the same table. But this time, the room was packed with others standing along the walls. Faces of every age. Workers and widows and children old enough to understand what was happening. Witnesses to either justice or mercy, depending on how the next hour unfolded. The scarred man who had spoken last time stood as they entered. Duke Ravenscar, welcome to Ashenmore. We were not certain you would come. Lucien's voice was steady. I'm here to honor the terms my wife proposed, to acknowledge my responsibility for the deaths that occurred during the riots of 1809, and to begin making reparations that should have been made 13 years ago. He moved to the table and set down a leather portfolio containing contracts, financial documents, and detailed plans for every commitment outlined in Serafina's proposal. These are legally binding agreements, funds established in perpetuity, infrastructure projects beginning immediately, educational opportunities guaranteed for children and grandchildren of those who died, all overseen independently to ensure transparency. He looked around the room, meeting eyes that had haunted his nightmares for over a decade. I cannot bring back the people you lost. I cannot undo the suffering my decisions caused. But I can ensure that their deaths were not meaningless. That something lasting is built from the ashes of that tragedy. The gray-haired woman stood slowly. Pretty words, Your Grace, but words are wind. How do we know you will not abandon these commitments the moment it becomes inconvenient? Lucien held her gaze. Because my wife will personally oversee implementation, and if I fail to honor any provision of these agreements, she has permission to expose every remaining scandal connected to my family. Financial corruption, political manipulation, everything that would destroy the Ravenscar name completely. He turned to Serafina. I am trusting her with my complete destruction, and she will not hesitate to use that power if I betray this agreement. The room was silent. Then a voice came from the back. Young, female, shaking with barely controlled emotion. My father died in those riots. He was a printer, not a rioter, just a man trying to get home to his family when soldiers opened fire. I was 8 years old when we buried him, and I have spent the last 13 years believing that the Duke of Ravenscar was a monster who did not care about people like us. She stepped forward into the light. But you are here, standing in front of us, offering reparations, looking us in the eyes instead of hiding behind wealth and titles. That takes more courage than I expected from someone like you. Lucien's throat tightened. What was your father's name? Thomas Hartley. Lucien nodded slowly. I remember his name from the casualty reports. I am sorry for your loss, and I am sorry it took me 13 years to say that directly. The young woman's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. Sorry does not bring him back. No, it does not. But it is all I have to offer, besides commitment to ensure other families do not suffer similar tragedies. The scarred man picked up the contracts and began reviewing them carefully. The room waited in silence while he read every page, every clause, every provision. Finally, he looked up. These terms are acceptable. We will sign as witnesses and hold you accountable to every word written here. But understand this, Duke Ravenscar. You are earning a chance, not forgiveness. If you honor these commitments, we will allow you to live and rebuild. If you betray us, we will destroy you so thoroughly that future generations will speak your name as warning. Lucien extended his hand. Understood. The scarred man took it, and they shook with the kind of grip that felt more like battle than peace. But it was a beginning. The signing took 2 hours. Every family representative reviewed the documents. Every provision was explained in detail. Questions were answered. Concerns were addressed. And through it all, Lucien remained present, engaged, treating them as equals instead of subordinates. Serafina watched him transform in real time. The cold aristocrat who had ruled through fear becoming something more complicated. Not warm, not soft, but human in ways he had forgotten how to be. When it was finished, they walked back to their horses in silence. Lucien stood beside his mount for a moment, staring back at the village. That was harder than any battle I ever fought. Serafina adjusted her cloak against the wind. Because battles are simple. Win or lose. Live or die. But this required something more difficult. What? Being wrong. Admitting it publicly. And surviving the consequences without armor. Lucien turned to look at her. Thank you for forcing me to do this. For believing I was capable of it when I did not believe it myself. You are welcome. But understand something, Lucien. This is only the beginning. Signing contracts is easy. Honoring them for years when no one is watching requires sustained commitment. And that is where most men fail. She mounted her horse. So do not fail, because I will not save you twice. They rode back toward Blackthorn Keep through afternoon light that felt marginally less cold than the morning had been. But halfway through the journey, they saw smoke rising from the direction of the castle. Thick, black. Too much to be normal fires. Lucien kicked his horse into a gallop. Serafina followed, heart pounding, mind racing through possibilities. They crested the final hill and saw Blackthorn Keep engulfed in flames. Not just a wing, not just the stables. The entire structure burning like a funeral pyre, visible for miles. And standing at the gates, watching it burn, was a figure wrapped in dark cloak. Waiting. As they rode closer, the figure turned. Margaret Ashford smiled from beneath her hood. Welcome home, Your Grace. I thought you might appreciate what I have done with the place. Lucien dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. How are you here? You were arrested, imprisoned. Margaret's smile widened. I was released 2 days ago on a technicality. Insufficient evidence. Witness testimony deemed unreliable. And the moment I walked free, I decided to finish what I started. She gestured toward the burning castle. You thought signing papers and making promises would save you. But redemption does not erase the past, Duke Ravenscar. It only postpones the reckoning. Serafina dismounted beside Lucien, eyes scanning the destruction. The staff. The servants. Where are they? Margaret's expression did not change. Most escaped. Some did not. Fire is indiscriminate that way. Lucien took a step forward, hands clenched into fists. You will hang for this. Will I? Or will I disappear into the same shadows that protected you for 13 years? The same system that allows powerful men to murder civilians and walk free? She turned to leave. Enjoy the ashes, Your Grace. I suspect you will be living in them for quite some time. Lucien started to move toward her. Serafina grabbed his arm. Let her go. What? Let her go. She wants you to attack, wants you to become the monster again so she can justify everything she has done. Do not give her that satisfaction. Lucien's entire body was rigid with fury. She burned down my home, killed my servants, destroyed everything. And chasing her now accomplishes nothing except validating her belief that violence is the only language you speak. Serafina pulled him back toward where guards were beginning to arrive, where survivors were emerging from the forest where they had fled. We save who we can. We rebuild what was destroyed. And we prove that she was wrong about you by refusing to let rage dictate your response. Lucien looked at the burning castle, at Margaret disappearing into the distance, at Serafina standing beside him with eyes that demanded he choose what kind of man he wanted to be. And in that moment, Duke Lucien Ravenscar made the hardest choice of his life. He let his enemy walk away. He turned toward the survivors who needed him. And he began the work of rebuilding from ashes instead of burning everything to the ground in revenge. Because that was what transformation actually looked like. Not one grand moment, but 1,000 small choices to be different than you were, even when every instinct screamed for blood. But as night fell and they organized survivors into temporary shelters, as they counted the dead and treated the wounded, as they watched Blackthorn Keep collapse into smoldering ruins, Lucien pulled Serafina aside. His voice was low, controlled, absolutely lethal. Margaret Ashford will not stop. She has proven that mercy means nothing to her, that reparations mean nothing, that every attempt at redemption will be met with more violence. So what do you propose? That we finish this permanently, before she burns down everything else we try to build. Serafina held his gaze. You want to kill her. I want to end a threat that will never stop until one of us is dead. Yes, that makes you exactly what she claims you are. No, it makes me pragmatic. There's a difference between murder and execution, and Margaret Ashford has earned execution. The wind carried smoke across the grounds, thick and choking. Serafina was quiet for several seconds. Then she said something that changed everything. If we do this, we do it my way. No rage, no revenge, just cold calculation and perfect execution. And when it is finished, we walk away clean. No evidence, no witnesses, no regrets. Lucien stared at her. You would help me kill her? I would help us survive. Because she is right about one thing. Some threats cannot be negotiated with. They can only be eliminated. She turned to face the ruins of Blackthorn Keep. But if we cross this line, there is no going back. We become the monsters everyone already believes we are, just more efficient versions. Lucien moved beside her, shoulder touching hers in the darkness. Then let us be monsters together. And let the world remember that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar do not forgive twice. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the burning ruins, Margaret Ashford smiled, because she had finally pushed them far enough, and the real war was about to begin. They hunted Margaret Ashford for 3 weeks through a London winter that felt like it would never end. Not with soldiers or constables or any official authority that could be traced back to the Ravenscar name. Just Lucien and Serafina moving through the city's shadows, like ghosts learning how to haunt their own story. They followed leads that evaporated into dead ends, chased rumors that dissolved into lies, watched from darkened doorways while Margaret moved through society like a woman who had already won, smiling at gatherings where aristocrats whispered about the Duke whose castle burned while he stood helpless. And through it all, something fundamental shifted between Lucien and Serafina. The distance that had existed since London collapsed into something more dangerous. Partnership forged in purpose that had nothing to do with titles or duty or anything resembling the cold arrangement that had brought them together. They spoke less but understood more, moved in coordination that required no words. And in the silence between hunting and waiting, they learned things about each other that daylight never would have revealed. That Serafina could track a target through crowded markets without being seen. That Lucien knew how to gather information from people society pretended did not exist. That both of them were capable of violence when necessity demanded it, but neither enjoyed it the way monsters did. Violence was tool, not identity, means, not purpose. And that distinction mattered more than anything else, as they closed in on a woman who had made destruction her entire reason for living. Because the difference between justice and murder was not the act itself. It was what you became afterward. They found her on the 19th day in a rented room above a bookshop near Covent Garden. Not hiding, just existing in the open like someone who believed she was untouchable. Serafina had traced her through a network of women who moved through London carrying messages and debts and secrets that men never noticed. Margaret had been careless exactly once, speaking too freely to someone who sold information cheaper than loyalty. And now Lucien stood outside that bookshop at midnight with a pistol loaded and ready while Serafina picked the lock on the rear entrance with tools she had acquired from places she refused to name. The door clicked open. They moved inside without speaking, up narrow stairs that creaked despite their careful steps, toward a room where lamplight showed beneath the door. Lucien reached for the handle. Serafina placed her hand over his, stopping him for exactly 3 seconds. Their eyes met in darkness, and something passed between them that had no language attached, understanding that what happened next would define them permanently. that crossing this threshold meant accepting they were capable of murder if they believed it was necessary, that all the talk about redemption and change meant nothing if they chose revenge when tested. Lucien's hand tightened on the pistol. Serafina released his wrist and stepped back. He opened the door. Margaret Ashford sat at a small writing desk with her back to them, pen moving across paper in the lamplight. She did not turn around when they entered, just continued writing with the deliberate calm of someone who had been expecting this moment for weeks. Duke Ravenscar. And the Duchess. How punctual. I was beginning to think you had lost your nerve. Lucien raised the pistol, aiming directly at the back of her head. You burned my home, killed innocent people, and now you sit here writing letters like none of it matters. Margaret set down her pen and turned slowly in her chair. She looked older than she had at the bridge, thinner, exhausted in ways that went deeper than physical tiredness. Her eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from spending years feeding yourself to hatred until nothing else remained. It matters, Your Grace. Every death, every fire, every moment of suffering. But what matters more is that you understand there is no redemption for men like you. No amount of reparations or apologies or good intentions that erase 17 corpses. You wanted to become better than your father shaped you to be. But you cannot become better. You can only pretend more convincingly. Lucien's finger moved to the trigger. I am not here to debate philosophy. I am here to end a threat. Then do it. Pull the trigger. Prove that beneath all your talk of change, you are still just a man who solves problems through violence. Confirm everything I have said about you. She smiled without humor. Or better yet, have your wife do it. She seems quite comfortable with darkness when necessary. Perhaps she is the real monster and you are simply her instrument. Serafina spoke for the first time, voice cold as frozen steel. You want him to kill you. You have wanted it since the moment you started this. Because martyrdom is easier than living with grief. Because dying at the hands of the monster validates every choice you made, every person you hurt, every line you crossed. Margaret's smile faded. I want justice for my husband. No, you want an ending, and you do not care if it is justice or murder, as long as the pain stops. Serafina moved closer until she stood beside Lucien. But we are not giving you that ending. We are not making you a martyr. We are not validating your belief that the only response to suffering is more suffering. She reached out and slowly pushed Lucien's pistol down until it pointed at the floor. We're going to do something far worse to you than death. We are going to let you live, and you are going to watch us rebuild everything you destroyed. Watch us honor the agreements we made with those 16 families. Watch the Ravenscar name transform from symbol of tyranny into something resembling leadership. And every day you survive will be a reminder that your revenge accomplished nothing except proving you were exactly as broken as the man you hated. Margaret's face went pale. You cannot. We can. And we will. You spent 13 years planning my husband's destruction. We are giving you the rest of your life to watch that destruction fail. Serafina turned to Lucien. We are leaving, now. Lucien stared at Margaret for exactly 5 seconds. Then he uncocked the pistol and slipped it back into his coat. You were wrong about me, Mrs. Ashford. I am capable of becoming better, but not because I am strong, because I finally found someone willing to show me that strength is not the same as violence. And weakness is not the same as mercy. He turned and walked toward the door. Margaret's voice came from behind them, shaking with rage and desperation. This is not over. I will find another way. I will destroy you even if it takes the rest of my life. Then you will waste your life, Serafina said without looking back. We are done being afraid of you, done giving your hatred power over our choices. You are welcome to spend the rest of your days plotting revenge that will never come. But we will be too busy building futures for people who actually want to live to notice. They left Margaret sitting in that lamplight room, surrounded by unfinished letters and rage that had nowhere left to go. And as they walked out into frozen London streets, Lucien realized something that shook him more than any confession or trial or burning castle ever had. For the first time in his entire life, he had chosen mercy not because it was strategic, but because it was right. And that small choice felt more revolutionary than any amount of power he had ever wielded. Because power could not change you. Only surrendering it could. They returned to the ruins of Blackthorn Keep 3 days later to find the work already begun. Not reconstruction, that would take years and resources they no longer possessed, but something else, workers clearing debris. engineers assessing what could be salvaged, and most surprisingly, families from Ashenmore arriving with supplies and labor, honoring commitments made in that village meeting hall. The scarred man who had negotiated with them stood amid the wreckage, directing efforts with the kind of authority that came from understanding how to build instead of destroy. He saw Lucien and Serafina approaching and walked over, expression unreadable. Your Grace? Duchess. We heard about the fire, thought you might need assistance rebuilding. Lucien looked around at the devastation that had been his family's seat of power for 300 years. Why? Why help the man who cost you so much? The scarred man was quiet for a moment. Because my daughter asked me what revenge actually accomplishes, and I could not give her an answer that did not sound like more pain disguised as justice. So we decided to try something different. We decided to be better than the circumstances that shaped us. He looked at Lucien directly. Same choice you are making. Same choice anyone makes who wants to survive with their humanity intact. You can spend your life paying for the past, or you can spend it building a future. We chose building. Seems like you did too. He extended his hand. Let us see if we can construct something worth defending this time. Lucien took his hand and felt something inside his chest crack open. Not breaking. Opening. The way ice splits when spring arrives and life pushes through from beneath frozen ground. Thank you for giving me chance I do not deserve. None of us deserve the chances we get, Your Grace. We just decide whether to waste them or honor them. You honored yours. That is enough. The scarred man returned to directing workers, leaving Lucien and Serafina standing amid ruins that suddenly felt less like endings and more like foundations waiting for something new to be built upon them. Serafina slipped her hand into his, and they stood there watching people work who had every reason to hate them but chose cooperation instead. Because that was what transformation actually looked like. Not dramatic moments of heroism or grand declarations of change, just quiet choices repeated daily until they became identity instead of performance. And somewhere in that realization, Duke Lucien Ravenscar finally understood what his father never had. That true power was not the ability to control others, it was the strength to control yourself. And that made all the difference. Bakim. They built temporary housing on the grounds while reconstruction continued. Not grand manors or aristocratic estates, but functional buildings designed to shelter people instead of impressing them. Lucien worked alongside laborers, learning trades he had never touched, understanding for the first time what physical exhaustion felt like when divorced from fear or obligation. His hands blistered and bled, his back ached. His body discovered muscles that aristocratic life had never required him to use. And through it all, Serafina remained present, not as decoration or symbol, but as partner equally invested in the work. She managed logistics, coordinated supplies, negotiated with merchants and craftsmen who suddenly found themselves dealing with a duchess who understood numbers better than most men twice her age. Together, they created something that looked less like dynasty restoration and more like community formation. People from Ashenmore mixed with former Blackthorn Keep servants. Laborers worked beside aristocrats who had lost everything in the fire. Class distinctions that had seemed permanent dissolved when everyone shared the same exhaustion and purpose. And in the slow accumulation of days spent building instead of destroying, Lucien found himself changing in ways he could not articulate but felt deeply. The cold calculation that had defined his every interaction softened into something more complicated. He learned people's names, not just to leverage them, but because they mattered. He listened to problems and offered solutions that prioritized their well-being over his advantage. He discovered that vulnerability was not weakness when shared with people who had earned trust through actions instead of fear. 6 months after the fire, they held a gathering in the partially rebuilt hall to celebrate progress and honor those who had made it possible. Nothing formal, no aristocratic posturing, just food and drink and music played by people who knew how to find joy, even when surrounded by reminders of devastation. Lucien stood at the edge of the room watching Serafina laugh with a group of workers' wives, and something in his chest tightened in ways that had nothing to do with pain. She had changed too. The careful composure she brought from London had relaxed into something more genuine. She smiled more, argued less cautiously, allowed herself to be seen in ways aristocratic training taught women to hide. The young woman whose father had died in the riots, Thomas Hartley's daughter, approached Lucien with a child balanced on her hip. "Your Grace, I wanted to thank you for the education fund. My younger brother will be attending university in the fall, first in our family. He wants to study engineering. Lucien felt something catch in his throat. Your father would be proud. She smiled, but there was sadness beneath it. Maybe. Or maybe he would be angry that it took his death to create opportunities for his children. I try not to think about it too much. Grief is complicated that way. Yes, it is. She shifted the child to her other hip. But I'm choosing to believe that good can come from tragedy if we let it. That my father's death was not meaningless if it leads to my brother building bridges or designing buildings that keep people safe. That is not justice exactly, but it is something. She turned to leave, then paused. You are different than I expected, Your Grace. More human. I hope you can forgive yourself someday the way we are learning to forgive you. Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd. Lucien stood there feeling those words settle into him like seeds planted in soil he had spent decades keeping barren. Forgiveness. He had spent so much energy seeking it from others that he had never considered whether he needed to give it to himself. Whether the man he had been at 24, desperate for his father's approval and convinced that cruelty was the only path to survival, deserved mercy from the man he was becoming at 36. Because holding yourself accountable and punishing yourself eternally were different things. One led to growth. The other led to paralysis. Serafina appeared beside him, 2 cups of wine in hand. She offered him one. You look contemplative. Dangerous state for you. I am thinking about forgiveness and whether I deserve it. From others or from yourself? Both. Serafina took a slow sip of wine. I think forgiveness is something you earn through sustained action, not grand gestures. You cannot demand it. You cannot shortcut it. You just keep choosing to be better until enough time passes that people realize you meant it. And as for forgiving yourself, she looked at him directly. That is the hardest part, because you know every failure intimately, every moment where you chose cruelty over kindness. Every person you hurt before you understood there were alternatives. But you have to forgive that version of yourself anyway. Not because he deserves it, but because carrying that weight forever prevents you from becoming who you need to be now. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. When did you become so wise? When I decided to marry a man everyone called a monster, and discovered he was just someone who had never been taught how to be anything else. She smiled slightly. You are learning, Lucien, slowly, imperfectly, but learning. And that is enough. Is it? It is for me. She set down her wine and took his hand. Dance with me. Here? Now? Yes. Here. Now. In front of everyone. Because I am tired of aristocratic distance and calculated appearances. I want them to see that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar are human, flawed, rebuilding, but human. She pulled him toward where music was playing and people were already dancing with the kind of unselfconscious joy that came from surviving hardship together. And Lucien, who had spent his entire life believing that vulnerability was weakness and displays of emotion were failures of discipline, allowed himself to be led onto that makeshift dance floor. Allowed himself to hold his wife in front of laborers and servants and families who had every reason to hate him. Allowed himself to move without grace or skill, just 2 people finding rhythm together while surrounded by others doing the same. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted inside him. Not redemption, not absolution, just acceptance that he was allowed to exist as more than the sum of his worst decisions. That change was possible if you were willing to endure the discomfort of becoming someone new. That love was not something you controlled or possessed, but something you chose daily through actions that proved it was real. The music played, the fire crackled in hearths built from salvaged stone, and Duke Lucien Ravenscar danced with his wife amid ruins that were slowly becoming home instead of prison. Because that was what resurrection looked like, not rising unchanged from ashes, but building something entirely different from what burned. Yet by state. 1 year after the fire, they received word that Margaret Ashford had been found dead in her rented room. Natural causes. Heart failure. The coroner suggested she had simply stopped fighting to survive, and her body surrendered to exhaustion that had been accumulating for over a decade. Lucien read the report without emotion, then set it down carefully. I should feel something. Relief, satisfaction, something. But you do not. No, Serafina sat beside him in the study they had rebuilt smaller and warmer than the original. Because revenge was never what you actually wanted. You wanted survival, safety, a future without constant threat. Her death does not give you that. You already built it yourself through choices that had nothing to do with her. She looked at the report. Margaret Ashford spent 13 years letting hatred consume her until nothing else remained. And in the end, the only person she destroyed was herself. There is lesson in that. Which is that we become what we feed. Feed anger, and it grows until it is all you are. Feed grief, and it hollows you out. But feed hope, even small hope, even fragile hope, and it gives you something to build on. Lucien leaned back in his chair, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. I do not know if I have built enough, if the reparations are sufficient, if the families will ever truly forgive, if I will ever stop feeling like I am one mistake away from becoming the monster everyone believed I was. Serafina reached out and took his hand. You will never stop feeling that. That is what accountability looks like. Not forgetting, not pretending the past did not happen, but carrying it forward and using it as a reminder of who you do not want to become. She squeezed his fingers gently. The man I met 2 years ago would have celebrated Margaret's death, would have seen it as confirmation that he won. But you are sitting here feeling nothing except sad that another person was destroyed by pain they could not release. That is growth, Lucien. Imperfect, complicated, but real. He looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life expecting cold arrangement and instead demanded he become human, and felt gratitude so profound it hurt. I would not have survived this without you, any of it. The scandal, the trial, the fire. I would have destroyed myself trying to maintain control. Yes, you would have. She said it without hesitation or comfort. But you did not. You chose differently, and that choice was yours, not mine. I just showed you there were alternatives. You had to decide to take them. Outside, spring was arriving slowly across northern England. Snow melting from cliffs, green pushing through frozen ground, light lasting slightly longer each evening, as if the world itself was exhaling after holding breath all winter. Lucien stood and moved to the window, watching workers plant gardens in spaces where military drills had once been conducted, watching children play in courtyards that had previously been restricted to aristocrats, watching something that looked like community forming in places designed for isolation. This is not what I expected my life to become. Is that complaint or observation? Observation. I thought power was the only thing that mattered. That legacy meant maintaining dynasty through force and fear. That love was weakness and vulnerability was failure. And now? Now I think power without purpose is just destruction wearing crown. That legacy means what you build, not what you conquer. And that love is the only thing strong enough to survive when everything else burns. He turned back to her. You taught me that. We taught each other, Serafina said quietly. You showed me that even people shaped into weapons can choose to become something else. That change is possible if you are willing to endure the pain of transformation. That redemption is not single moment, but sustained commitment to being different tomorrow than you were today. She stood and crossed to stand beside him at the window. We are not perfect, Lucien. We never will be. But we are better than we were, and that is enough. They stood together watching spring arrive, two people who had been brought together by strategy and stayed together through choice. Not because circumstances required it, not because duty demanded it, but because they had learned how to see each other as human instead of roles, as partners instead of possessions, as people who could become more together than they ever would have been alone. And that was the real transformation. Not external, internal. The slow accumulation of small changes that eventually rebuilt everything from foundation up. 5 years after the fire, Blackthorn Keep stood rebuilt. Not as fortress, not as monument to aristocratic power, but as center for community that served northern territories in ways the original castle never had. Schools occupied wings previously reserved for entertaining nobility. Medical facilities treated people who could not afford London physicians. Libraries held books accessible to anyone willing to learn. The Ravenscar name still carried weight, but it was weight earned through action instead of fear. Lucien sat on advisory councils focused on labor rights and industrial safety. Serafina established networks supporting women's education and economic independence. Together, they navigated the slow work of transforming systems instead of just mitigating damage they caused. It was harder than ruling through fear had ever been. But it was sustainable in ways tyranny never was. They had a daughter now, 2 years old, dark hair like her father, sharp eyes like her mother. A child born into a world where her parents were teaching her that power meant responsibility instead of dominion. That strength meant admitting weakness. That legacy meant building institutions that served people instead of controlling them. One evening, Lucien stood in the nursery watching Serafina put their daughter to sleep, and something in his chest tightened with emotion he had spent 35 years believing he was incapable of feeling. Not possession, not control. Love. Uncomplicated. Unstrategic. Just pure feeling that terrified him precisely because he could not weaponize it or leverage it or use it to maintain advantage. Serafina looked up and caught him watching. She smiled and crossed to where he stood. "What are you thinking?" "That I do not know how to be a father. That my only model was man who measured love by how thoroughly I destroyed myself to earn his approval. That I am terrified of repeating his mistakes." "Then you already are a better father than he was. Because you are asking those questions instead of assuming you know the answers." She leaned against him. "You will make mistakes, Lucien. Lucien, you will be too controlling sometimes, too protective, too afraid that showing weakness will somehow damage her. But you will also show her that men can be gentle, that power does not require cruelty, that her father became better than he was by accepting help instead of refusing it." "What if that is not enough?" "Then she will learn the same lesson we learned. That being enough is impossible, but trying to become better is everything." They stood there watching their daughter sleep, two people who had survived aristocracy's worst impulses and built something resembling family from the wreckage. And Lucien realized that this quiet moment with no witnesses or grand gestures or performances required was the real victory. Not political influence, not restored reputation, just being present in ways that mattered to people who saw him as human instead of symbol. That was the power worth keeping. Everything else was just weight that prevented you from moving forward. 10 years after the fire, Lucien received a letter from someone he had not thought about in years. Lord Cedric Morcant's son, 25 years old now, fresh from university, writing to request meeting. Lucien read it 3 times before showing it to Serafina. She read it once and handed it back. "What do you want to do?" "I do not know. Part of me wants to refuse, to avoid reopening wounds that finally healed. But another part thinks I owe him explanation, acknowledgement, something. Then meet with him. Not because you owe him anything, but because it might give him closure you wish your father had given you." So Lucien agreed to the meeting. They sat in the rebuilt study. No weapons, no guards, just 2 men trying to understand how to exist in a world shaped by their father's choices. Young Morcant looked like Cedric. Same elegant features, same careful composure, but his eyes held something his father's never had. Uncertainty, vulnerability, the willingness to admit he did not have all the answers. "Your Grace, thank you for seeing me. I know this is uncomfortable, very, but necessary things often are." The young man nodded slowly. "I spent years hating you, believing you murdered my father, planning revenge the way he planned yours. But then I started researching, really investigating what happened, and I discovered things that complicated the narrative I had built. Such as that my father was not innocent, that he manipulated Margaret Ashford, used her grief as weapon, orchestrated events that led to his own death because he believed martyrdom would destroy you more thoroughly than scandal. He gambled that someone would kill him and you would be blamed. He was partially correct." Young Morcant looked down at his hands. "I am not here for revenge, Your Grace. I am here because I need to understand how you survived becoming something other than what your father shaped you into, how you built life after losing everything, how you found peace when revenge seemed like the only option." Lucien was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I survived because I stopped believing I had to. Stopped thinking survival required maintaining control or power or fear. I let everything collapse, let the world see me broken. And in that breaking, I discovered I was more than the armor I wore. I was human, flawed, capable of change if I accepted help." He looked at the young man directly. "Your father spent his entire life believing power was the only thing that mattered, that revenge would satisfy something inside him that felt empty. But revenge is hunger that consumes itself. It never stops, never satisfies. just grows until you are nothing except anger walking around in human skin. I do not want to become that. Then do not. Choose differently. Build something instead of destroying. Find people who see you as more than your father's son, and forgive him for being too broken to teach you how to be whole. Young Morcant's eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. Thank you for being honest, for not pretending you are somehow better now, for showing me that transformation is messy and uncomfortable and never fully complete. He stood to leave. I do not know if we can be friends, Your Grace. Too much history, too much pain, but perhaps we can be something else. Two men who survived fathers who measured love by body count. That is connection. At least, Lucien stood and extended his hand. It is more than connection. It is hope, and hope is everything. They shook hands and young Morcant left. Serafina appeared in the doorway moments later. How was it? Lucien looked at her and smiled. Real smile, earned through years of learning how. It was human, complicated, imperfect, and exactly what both of us needed. Good. Then you are learning. She crossed the room and kissed him gently. I am proud of you, for who you have become, for who you are still becoming. Lucien pulled her close and held her the way he had learned to hold things that mattered, not possessively, not desperately, just with steady commitment that said, I choose this and I choose you, and I choose to keep choosing even when it is hard. Because that was what love actually was. Not feeling, not passion, not ownership, choice. Repeated daily until it became foundation everything else was built upon. And Duke Lucien Ravenscar, the man who had been shaped into weapon, broken into pieces, and slowly rebuilt into something resembling human, finally understood that the greatest power he would ever possess was not ability to control others. It was the courage to keep choosing connection even when isolation felt safer, to keep choosing growth even when stagnation felt easier, to keep choosing love even when fear felt justified. That was the real victory, not conquering, not dominating, just surviving yourself and becoming something better because of it. 20 years after the fire, Lucien stood on the cliffs above Blackthorn Keep, watching the sun set across northern England. His hair was gray now. His body carried scars from labor and life. His hands showed age in ways aristocratic existence never would have required. But he was alive, not just breathing, living, building, creating, contributing. Serafina appeared beside him, older but no less sharp, no less present. What are you thinking about? Everything. Nothing. How strange it is that the life I have now is so different from anything I imagined. Better or worse? Just different. But the kind of different that feels earned instead of inherited. She slipped her hand into his. We did well, Lucien. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but well enough. He looked at the castle below, at the communities surrounding it, at the lives being lived in spaces that once held only fear. Yes, we did. They stood together as darkness arrived, two people who had survived aristocracy's worst impulses and built something worth defending from its ruins. Not empire, not dynasty, just small corner of a world that was slightly better because they had chosen to make it so. And that was enough. That was everything. Because real power was not measured in titles or land or people who feared you. It was measured in lives improved, in choices that built instead of destroyed, in willingness to admit you were wrong and spend the rest of your life proving you meant it. Duke Lucien Ravenscar would never be remembered as great man in ways his father defined greatness, but he would be remembered as good man. And that distinction made all the difference. The sun disappeared below the horizon. Darkness covered the land. But inside Blackthorn Keep, lights burned warm and steady, fires that built instead of consuming, warmth that welcomed instead of warned, home instead of fortress. And that was how empires actually fell. Not through conquest or rebellion or external destruction, but through transformation. One small choice at a time, until everything that was became something entirely new. And the Duke who learned too late that power without humanity was just tyranny wearing crown finally rested. Not because the fight was finished, but because he had become man capable of fighting differently, with compassion instead of cruelty, with hope instead of fear, with love that survived because it was chosen, not commanded. And in that choice lived the only victory that ever truly mattered. The story ended not with conquest, but with peace, Hard won, imperfect, real, and that was enough.